The morning sun cast long shadows across the dense jungle as Captain Maria Rodriguez checked her flight instruments one final time. The radio crackled with urgent messages from command headquarters, painting a picture that made her stomach tighten with worry. Somewhere deep in enemy territory, 280 American soldiers were completely cut off from their base. Surrounded by hostile forces that grew stronger by the hour, the mission had started as a routine patrol 3 days earlier. The soldiers from the 7th Infantry Battalion had been sent to secure a strategic valley that intelligence reports claimed was lightly defended. What they found instead was a carefully planned trap. Enemy forces had allowed them to advance deep into the valley before closing off every escape route with roadblocks. Snipers and heavy artillery positions, command had tried everything to reach the trapped soldiers. Ground reinforcements were blocked by enemy positions that seemed impossible to break through. Artillery strikes had been called in, but the enemy had positioned themselves too close to the American troops, making it impossible to attack without risking friendly fire. Every helicopter rescue mission had been turned back by intense anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky with deadly metal. Maria had been flying supply missions for 2 years, delivering food, ammunition, and medical supplies to forward bases across the war zone. She had earned respect among her fellow pilots for her steady nerves and precise flying skills, but she had never been assigned to a combat rescue mission. The commanders considered such dangerous operations too risky for supply pilots, especially female ones who were not supposed to fly into active combat zones according to military regulations. As she listened to the desperate radio communications, Maria learned that the trapped soldiers were running critically low on everything they needed to survive. Their ammunition was nearly gone after 3 days of constant fighting. Medical supplies had been exhausted treating wounded men who needed immediate evacuation to field hospitals. Most importantly, their water was running dangerously low in the jungle heat, and several soldiers were already showing signs of severe dehydration. The enemy forces seemed to understand that time was on their side. They had established a tight perimeter around the valley, content to wait while the Americans slowly weakened from hunger, thirst, and exhaustion. Intelligence reports suggested that a major enemy offensive was planned for the following morning. When the trapped soldiers would be too weak to mount an effective defense, Maria found herself studying maps of the area, tracing possible flight paths that might avoid the heaviest concentrations of enemy fire. Her fellow pilots noticed her intense focus and warned her not to get any dangerous ideas. The military hierarchy was clear about who could and could not fly combat missions, and supply pilots were expected to stay safely behind the lines. But as the hours passed and the situation grew more desperate, Maria could not shake the feeling that someone had to try something different. The standard rescue attempts had all failed because they followed predictable patterns that the enemy had learned to counter. Perhaps what was needed was an approach so unexpected that the enemy would not be prepared for it. The weight of 280 lives pressed heavily on her mind as she completed her regular supply run that evening. Each face she imagined among the trapped soldiers belonged to someone's son, husband, or brother. They were counting on their military to find a way to bring them home safely, but conventional tactics had proven inadequate against the enemy's well-prepared positions. That night, Maria could not sleep as she reviewed everything she knew about the trapped soldiers' situation. The enemy had positioned anti-aircraft guns at all the obvious approach routes, making conventional helicopter rescues nearly impossible. But her experience flying supply missions had taught her about the unusual wind patterns in that particular valley, knowledge that might prove crucial in finding an alternative approach. She remembered a conversation with an old transport pilot who had flown missions in the same area during earlier campaigns. He had mentioned a narrow canyon that cut through the mountains on the eastern side of the valley, creating unpredictable air currents that made flying extremely dangerous. Most pilots avoided the area completely because the shifting winds could slam an aircraft into the canyon walls without warning. However, Maria realized that this same dangerous terrain feature might provide exactly the cover needed to reach the trapped soldiers. The enemy would not expect an aircraft to approach from that direction because the route seemed suicidal. If she could navigate the treacherous canyon successfully, she might be able to reach the soldiers before the enemy forces could react. The more she studied the maps, the more convinced she became that this unconventional approach represented the only realistic chance of saving the trapped battalion. But she also understood that attempting such a mission would require directly disobeying orders from her commanding officers, who had explicitly forbidden any unauthorized rescue attempts. Early the next morning, Maria approached her maintenance crew chief with a carefully crafted story about needing to test her helicopter's new navigation equipment. She convinced him to load her aircraft with extra medical supplies and emergency rations, claiming they were needed for a routine supply drop at a forward base. The crew chief, who had worked with Maria for months, trusted her completely and did not question the unusual request. As she performed her pre-flight checks, Maria's hands trembled slightly with nervous energy. She had never deliberately disobeyed military orders before, and the consequences of her planned action could include court-martial and imprisonment. But the alternative was allowing 280 brave soldiers to die when she might have the skills and knowledge needed to save them. The radio chatter from command headquarters grew increasingly frantic as reports came in about the enemy's final preparations for their assault. Intelligence indicated that the attack would begin within hours, and the trapped soldiers had sent their final desperate messages requesting immediate evacuation for their most severely wounded men. Maria made her decision as she started her helicopter's engines. She would follow her planned route through the dangerous canyon, trusting her flying skills and knowledge of the local wind patterns to see her through. If she succeeded in reaching the soldiers, she would evacuate as many wounded men as possible before the enemy could organize an effective response. Her heart pounded as she lifted off from the base, turning eastward toward the mountains instead of following her assigned supply route. She knew that radar operators would notice her deviation from the planned flight path within minutes, but by then it would be too late for anyone to stop her mission. The helicopter climbed steadily toward the mountain ridge that separated her from the trapped soldiers. Below, the jungle canopy stretched endlessly in all directions, hiding enemy positions and friendly forces alike. Maria checked her fuel gauges and calculated exactly how much flying time she would have before needing to return to base. The approach to the canyon proved even more challenging than Maria had anticipated. As her helicopter climbed toward the mountain ridge, the air became increasingly turbulent, buffeting the aircraft with sudden updrafts and downdrafts that tested her piloting skills to their limits. The narrow canyon entrance appeared ahead like a jagged wound in the mountainside, barely wide enough for her helicopter's rotor blades to clear the rocky walls. Maria reduced her airspeed and began the delicate process of threading her aircraft through the canyon's treacherous passage. The walls rose hundreds of feet on both sides, creating a natural wind tunnel that generated unpredictable air currents. Her helicopter shuddered and bucked as invisible forces tried to slam it into the unforgiving stone surfaces that seemed to reach out toward her spinning rotors. Halfway through the canyon, a violent crosswind caught the aircraft and sent it careening toward the southern wall. Maria fought the controls desperately, using every technique she had learned during her years of flying in difficult conditions. The helicopter's tail rotor came within inches of striking the rock face before she managed to regain control and center the aircraft. In the narrow passage, sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool mountain air flowing through the canyon. She had committed herself completely to this course of action, and turning back was no longer possible in the confined space. The only way out was forward, through the remaining miles of dangerous terrain that separated her from the trapped soldiers. As she emerged from the canyon's eastern end, Maria found herself flying over enemy territory for the first time in her military career. The landscape below showed clear signs of the ongoing conflict, with bomb craters dotting the jungle floor and smoke rising from recent artillery strikes. She kept her helicopter low, using the terrain features to mask her approach from enemy radar installations. Radio communications from the trapped battalion painted an increasingly desperate picture. The enemy assault had begun earlier than expected, with waves of infantry attacking the Americans' defensive perimeter from multiple directions. The soldiers were fighting with courage and determination, but their ammunition was critically low and they had no way to call in artillery support without risking strikes on their own positions. Maria pushed her helicopter to its maximum safe speed as she raced toward the coordinates, where the battalion had established their defensive position. She could hear the sound of gunfire growing louder as she approached the valley, confirming that the final battle for the soldiers' lives had already begun. The valley came into view suddenly as Maria crested a low ridge, revealing a scene of intense combat below. Muzzle flashes lit up the jungle undergrowth as the trapped soldiers fought desperately to hold their positions against overwhelming enemy numbers. Smoke from explosions obscured much of the battlefield, making it difficult to distinguish between friendly and hostile forces. Maria immediately understood why previous rescue attempts had failed so completely. The enemy had positioned anti-aircraft guns at every logical landing zone, creating overlapping fields of fire that would destroy any helicopter attempting a conventional approach. The Americans had been forced into a defensive perimeter barely large enough to contain their numbers. With wounded soldiers lying exposed in the center of their position, she circled the area once, studying the tactical situation and looking for any possible landing site that might offer her helicopter some protection from enemy fire. The soldiers below noticed her aircraft and began signaling frantically, using mirrors and colored panels to mark their exact position and indicate the locations of their most seriously wounded men. The enemy forces also spotted her helicopter and immediately began redirecting their anti-aircraft fire toward this new threat. Streams of tracer bullets arced through the air around Maria's aircraft, forcing her to take evasive action while still trying to identify a safe approach route to the trapped soldiers. Maria realized that a conventional landing was impossible under the intense enemy fire, but she noticed something that previous rescue pilots had missed. A small clearing existed just outside the soldiers' defensive perimeter, hidden from most enemy positions by a cluster of large boulders and fallen trees. The space was barely large enough for her helicopter, and reaching it would require flying directly through the heaviest concentration of anti-aircraft fire. She made a split-second decision that would either save lives or cost her everything. Instead of attempting to land in the clearing, she would hover just above the treetops and use her helicopter's rescue winch to evacuate the most critically wounded soldiers one at a time. This technique was extremely dangerous because it would expose her aircraft to enemy fire for an extended period, but it offered the only realistic chance of saving lives. Maria keyed her radio and established contact with the battalion commander on the ground. Captain James Morrison's voice crackled through the static, filled with amazement and gratitude that someone had actually reached them. She quickly explained her plan and asked him to prioritize the wounded soldiers who needed immediate medical attention to survive. The first wounded soldier was a young private who had taken shrapnel from a mortar round in his chest and legs. Two of his fellow soldiers carried him to the designated pickup point while Maria maneuvered her helicopter into position above the trees. Enemy bullets struck her aircraft's armor plating as she lowered the rescue basket on its steel cable, but she maintained steady control despite the incoming fire. Loading the wounded soldier into the basket and winching him up to safety took nearly 3 minutes of continuous hovering under enemy fire. Maria's helicopter absorbed multiple hits during the process, with warning lights beginning to flash on her instrument panel. But the young private was safely aboard, and she immediately began preparations for the next evacuation. The second rescue proved even more challenging because the enemy had adjusted their fire to target her helicopter's new position. A burst of machine gun fire shattered her side window and sent glass fragments across the cockpit. But Maria continued operating the winch controls with steady hands. The wounded soldier below was unconscious from blood loss, requiring his squad mates to secure him carefully in the rescue basket before signaling for the lift dot as she evacuated the third wounded soldier. Maria noticed that her helicopter's fuel consumption had increased dramatically due to the stress of continuous hovering and maneuvering. She calculated that she had enough fuel for perhaps 2 more rescue runs before being forced to return to base. The realization that she could not save everyone weighed heavily on her mind. But she was determined to evacuate as many wounded soldiers as possible. The battalion commander radioed that they had identified 5 soldiers who would certainly die without immediate medical attention. Maria confirmed that she understood the situation and would continue operations until her fuel ran critically low. She asked Captain Morrison to have the remaining wounded soldiers ready for rapid evacuation to maximize the number of lives she could save. The 4th rescue attempt nearly ended in disaster when a rocket-propelled grenade exploded just meters from her helicopter's tail rotor. The blast wave sent the aircraft spinning sideways, and for a terrifying moment Maria thought she had lost control completely. But her years of training kicked in, and she managed to stabilize the helicopter. Despite significant damage to its rear stabilizer, warning alarms sounded throughout the cockpit as multiple systems began failing from battle damage. Maria realized that her helicopter was slowly losing power and altitude, making it increasingly difficult to maintain the precise hovering required for winch operations. She had perhaps one more rescue attempt before the aircraft would become unflyable. The 5th wounded soldier was Sergeant Thomas Chun, a squad leader who had been struck by sniper fire while directing his men's defensive positions. His soldiers had fashioned a makeshift stretcher from their equipment, allowing them to move him to the pickup point despite his serious injuries. Maria lowered her rescue basket one final time, knowing that this evacuation would push her damaged helicopter beyond its safe operating limits. As Maria winched up Sergeant Chun, her helicopter's engine began making ominous sounds that indicated imminent failure. Oil pressure was dropping rapidly, and the main rotor was vibrating in a way that suggested critical damage to the transmission system. She knew that attempting another rescue would almost certainly result in a crash that would kill everyone aboard her aircraft, with 5 wounded soldiers secured in her cargo bay. Maria made the agonizing decision to depart for the nearest medical facility. The soldiers on the ground understood her situation and signaled their gratitude even as she prepared to leave them behind. Captain Morrison radioed his thanks and assured her that her actions had already saved lives that would have been lost without her intervention. The flight back to safety became a race against mechanical failure as her helicopter's systems continued deteriorating. Maria had to constantly adjust her controls to compensate for the damaged tail rotor, while monitoring engine temperatures that climbed steadily toward the red zone. The wounded soldiers behind her needed immediate surgery, making any delay potentially fatal. She chose to fly directly back toward friendly lines rather than attempting the safer but longer route through the canyon. This decision meant crossing directly over enemy positions, but her helicopter's condition left her no choice. The aircraft was losing altitude gradually, and she needed to reach medical facilities as quickly as possible. Enemy forces on the ground opened fire as her helicopter passed overhead, but Maria was flying too low and fast for them to achieve accurate targeting. Tracer rounds streaked past her aircraft, but none found their mark during the brief exposure over hostile territory. Her focus remained entirely on nursing her damaged helicopter through its final miles of flight. The friendly base came into view, just as her engine finally began failing completely. Maria declared an emergency over the radio and requested immediate medical teams to meet her aircraft at the landing zone. She managed to auto-rotate her helicopter into a controlled crash landing that left the aircraft destroyed, but allowed all 5 wounded soldiers to be evacuated alive to the waiting ambulances. Medical personnel rushed the rescued soldiers into surgery while Maria was checked for injuries from her own ordeal. She had sustained minor cuts from flying glass and was suffering from exhaustion, but her condition was stable. The 5 men she had rescued all survived their surgeries and would eventually make full recoveries thanks to the prompt medical attention she had made possible. News of Maria's unauthorized rescue mission spread rapidly through the military command structure. Her immediate superiors were furious about her violation of direct orders, and she faced the possibility of serious disciplinary action, including court-martial proceedings. But reports of her heroic actions also reached higher levels of command. where senior officers recognized the exceptional courage she had demonstrated. Meanwhile, the situation of the remaining trapped soldiers had worsened significantly. Enemy forces had intensified their assault after witnessing the successful helicopter evacuation, determined to prevent any additional rescue attempts. The Americans' ammunition was now completely exhausted, and they were fighting with captured enemy weapons and improvised explosive devices. Captain Morrison sent a final radio message indicating that his battalion could not hold their position much longer without immediate reinforcement or evacuation. Enemy forces were preparing for a final assault that would overwhelm the Americans' weakened defenses within hours. The success of Maria's rescue mission had proven that evacuation was possible, but conventional military doctrine still prohibited the type of unauthorized action she had taken. Higher command faced a critical decision about how to respond to the desperate situation. Maria's actions had demonstrated that skilled pilots could reach the trapped soldiers despite enemy defenses, but ordering such missions would require accepting significant casualties among rescue crews. The military leadership had to weigh the lives of 275 remaining soldiers against the risks to pilots and aircraft crews who would attempt additional rescue missions. General Patricia Williams, the regional commander, made a decision that would change military doctrine forever. After reviewing Maria's mission reports and consulting with her tactical advisors, she authorized a massive rescue operation based on the techniques Maria had pioneered. Instead of court-martialing the female pilot, she promoted her to major and placed her in charge of training other pilots for similar high-risk missions. Within 6 hours, Maria was back in the air leading a formation of 12 specially equipped helicopters toward the trapped battalion. Each aircraft had been fitted with additional armor plating and carried experienced combat pilots, who had volunteered for the dangerous mission. The pilots had studied Maria's route through the canyon and practiced the hovering techniques required for winch evacuations under fire. The rescue fleet approached the valley just as enemy forces launched their final assault against the weakened American defenses. The timing proved crucial because the enemy's attention was focused on their ground attack, leaving their anti-aircraft positions temporarily undermanned. Maria led the first wave of helicopters through the canyon passage, with each pilot successfully navigating the treacherous route she had discovered. The massive rescue operation caught enemy forces completely off guard. While they had prepared for another single helicopter attempt, the sight of 12 aircraft simultaneously entering the valley from an unexpected direction created chaos in their defensive coordination. Anti-aircraft gunners struggled to engage multiple targets that were approaching from different angles and elevations. Maria coordinated the rescue efforts with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. She assigned specific helicopters to different sections of the American perimeter, ensuring that wounded soldiers received priority while also evacuating healthy troops, who could carry critical intelligence about enemy positions. The operation proceeded with remarkable efficiency despite the continuing battle raging below. The trapped soldiers fought with renewed determination when they saw the rescue fleet arriving. Captain Morrison's men provided covering fire for the evacuation zones while systematically destroying sensitive equipment and documents that could not fall into enemy hands. Their morale soared as they watched their wounded comrades being lifted to safety by the hovering helicopters. Enemy forces attempted to concentrate their fire on the rescue aircraft, but the pilots had learned from Maria's experience and employed constant movement to avoid becoming stationary targets. Several helicopters sustained battle damage, but their armor modifications and skilled piloting prevented any aircraft from being shot down during the operation. The evacuation required 4 hours of continuous operations, with helicopters making multiple trips between the valley and friendly bases. Maria personally oversaw the rescue of Captain Morrison and his command staff, ensuring that the battalion's leadership survived to provide detailed intelligence about enemy tactics and positions. By sunset, all 275 remaining soldiers had been successfully evacuated from the valley. The enemy found themselves in control of an empty defensive position while American forces had preserved an entire battalion that intelligence deemed critical for upcoming operations. The success demonstrated that unconventional tactics and exceptional courage could overcome seemingly impossible military situations. Maria's action sparked a complete revision of military policies regarding female pilots and high-risk combat missions. Her techniques became standard training for special operations pilots, and her story inspired a new generation of aviators who understood that following orders was important. But saving lives sometimes required the courage to break rules when higher principles were at stake. The 5 soldiers from her original unauthorized mission attended her promotion ceremony, standing as living proof that individual initiative could make the difference between life and death in warfare. Their presence reminded everyone that behind every military decision were real people, whose lives depended on the courage and skill of their fellow service members. Years later, the canyon route Maria discovered became known as Rodriguez Pass in her honor, serving as a permanent reminder that heroism sometimes requires defying authority to serve a higher calling. Her example continued inspiring military personnel to think creatively about solving impossible problems and never giving up on saving lives.